With our buttonholes made, we're ready to sew on buttons. So for today's sample, I'm using a piece of felt. You can use a piece of your scrap fabric that's big enough for you to handle. I have a button with 2 holes. I have a toothpick, or you can use a pin, and a needle and thread. The first step, you want to cut a piece of thread about 20 inches, which is an arm length. That's always a good length of thread to use. And then you want to thread your needle. And I'm going to thread this needle and pull the thread through so it's double. When you sew on buttonholes, you always sew with a double thread. I'm not going to make a knot in the thread, however. I'm going to use the double strand of thread and take 2 or 3 stitches in the felt sample fabric. That's going to be a securing stitch. So I'm going to take 2, let me move this down so you can see a little bit better, fairly small stitches. And I don't have to position this button because it's a sample, but we already positioned the buttons. And I'm going to take the stitch in the same place. And what happens is this forms a locking stitch and you don't need a knot, which creates an extra bump. And then I'm going to clip my threads off down to about 1/4 inch. Now what I'm ready to do is sew on my button. So I'm going to bring the needle through one of the buttonholes, like so. I'm going to put the toothpick on top and go through the other one, and I want to go into my stitch exactly where I sewed it before. So I check and I'm in the exact same spot, and then I want to come out in the same spot. You want to keep it very neat on the underside, so you have to look at where you started and stopped. So I come out and I go over my toothpick and I check on the bottom to see if I'm coming out in the right spot, and if I'm not, I adjust it a little bit because I want it to be neat on the bottom side. And then I go back in and I do this 4 or 5 times. And I'm always checking top and bottom to make sure I'm not getting any loopy stitches, and I'm always going into and out of the same spots, like so. So you're always kind of turning it around. And I'll take one more stitch. Now, on the last stitch, it says, bring the needle and thread to the right side under the button. So what I want to do is bring my needle and thread under the button through the fabric, like so. And I come out through. And then you take your toothpick out. And what we're doing now is creating a thread shank. If we sewed the button tight to the fabric, it would not be able to button. And you want to wind the thread 3 or 4 times around the stitches under the button to form a thread shank. So you just take it and wrap it around 3 or 4 times, like so. And then you take your thread and you're going to knot it off into that thread shank. You're going to put the needle in and come out with a loop. And I'm going to pull it through once and tighten it, and pull it through twice and tighten it, and then pull it through a final time. And I have a secure knot, and I'm going to clip this down to about 1/4 inch so it hides under my button and my button is sewed on. So it's sewed on tight there and neat stitches there. Now, if you have a small button and you don't want your stitches to show, you can bring the thread underneath and make a knot in the stitches underneath. But once again, it's small and you clipped it down to about 1/4 inch. And you've got a thread shank under there. When you show me your sample, I would like 3 pictures of it. The front, so that I can see that there's no loopy stitches, the back, and then just let me see that you have a thread shank underneath. And when you sew your buttons on, and I've sewed them on the vest, and you want to pay attention to your markings. And when you have a couple of buttons to sew on, it's a good idea to sew one on and see if the others are still lined up. Because if one's off and you sew the other two, then they're all off. Now, there is one last step to making this vest, and that's attaching a buckle on the back tie. So what you do is you turn it over and it goes on the left side. I put a pin in there just so I didn't forget. And you take your tie, and right here it says fold line. So what I do is I line this up, and remember I have 3/8 of an inch, and here's my fold line. And I'm going to do some pin marking. Let me move this back a little so you can see it. Right here is the fold line. I'm going to put a pin right here, and then I'm going to put my buckle on, and that fold line goes right over the fold of the buckle where I've pinned it, and then I'm just going to bring it to the sewing machine and sew it down, and I have a buckle on there, and the vest is done.